My name's Peter Mayers, and I present The National Interest on ABC Radio National. It's my pleasure to be the moderator of this evening's discussion. With me here on stage are 4 guests. They all write in various ways about water, and I'll introduce them to you in turn as they come to speak, beginning with Canadian environmentalist and writer Maud Barlow, who's the founder of the Blue Planet Project and author of Blue Covenant, The Global Water Crisis and the Coming Battle for Water. Maud Barlow, to begin, is the world running out of water?
We're not running out of water in the sense that the water hasn't left the planet, but we are running out of clean, accessible water very fast. The story is very simple. We all learned back in grade 6 that it was impossible to run out of water. Turns out that wasn't true. Turns out that as we pollute surface water, particularly in the global south, people don't have surface water to use to farm and to drink and to fish in and so on. And so we're turning to groundwater and wilderness water and river water, and we're extending them, mining them, extracting them far faster than they can be replenished by nature. We're also producing our food by flood irrigation, often in places where we should not be growing food. We're also conducting what's called virtual water export, which is where you export massive amounts. Australia is a huge virtual water exporter, massive amounts of your water out through commodity production. So it's not the actual water, but the water embedded in products that we send away. We're destroying water retentive landscape from massive urbanization or from dams, from deforestation, from loss of wetland, so that we're actually creating new areas of desert at a very alarming rate. China is creating an area of desert the size of Rhode Island every single year because they're using all their water to make all the toys and shower curtain liners and so on in the world. And so they've diverted their water to that purpose. And we're piping water. We're beginning to lay pipes around the world to take water from where it's needed in the hydrologic cycle, for a healthy hydrologic cycle, from where it's needed in nature to where we want it to be. And if we're anywhere near, in big cities anywhere near the ocean, we dump it in the ocean. We don't return it to the land and to the cycle. We must stop blaming solely climate change. It's too easy to say climate change made me do it, and I have to say I hear that in my country. I'm certainly hearing that a great deal here. Yes, of course, climate change has an enormous impact on water, but the way we mismanage, abuse, and move water from where it's needed, especially with this water trading here, which I hope we'll get into, the more we're actually affecting climate change by our abuse of water. And I don't think we have the analysis right on climate change yet until we start understanding what we're doing with water. The world is running out of water. It is the most, in my opinion, the most serious ecological and human rights threat of our time.
Thank you, Maud Barlow. Let's get an Australian response to that from one of Australia's leading experts on rivers. Dr. Paul Sinclair is the Healthy Ecosystems Program Manager for the Australian Conservation Foundation. And Paul Sinclair is also an environmental historian whose PhD, The Murray, A River and Its People, was published as a book a few years ago. Paul Sinclair, I guess it's pretty obvious in Australia that we're running out of water.
Well, it is and it isn't. There's no doubt that over the last 10 or 12 years, with the dry conditions we've faced, we have less water available to suck out of our rivers. But there's no doubt that rivers have been running out of water for a very long time. Rivers like the Goulburn River in Victoria, can take up to 80% of the water out of the Goulburn, or 75% out of the Murray. Elvis Presley isn't taking that water. We're taking that water out of those rivers. And if you take 80% of the water out of a river, it's exactly the same as taking 80% of the blood flow from your bodies. And if I take 80% of the blood from your bodies, will you be happy or sad? The answer is sad. So we've been running out of water for a long time, but in terms of our river systems, we've been forcing that scarcity on river systems. In terms of our cities, actually, I wonder whether we are running out of water. If we want to live in a dreamland where we can flush the best drinking water on the planet down the toilet, maybe we are running out of water. If we want to allocate 70% of our water to agriculture and we want to continue to use high water using crops, well then, yes, we are going to run out of water. I think we need to ask some different questions about what is it we want to achieve with our water use? What sort of community do we want? What sort of agricultural production do we want? Then we need to ask some other questions about, well, what sort of water do you need to achieve those goals? Do you need the best drinking water on earth to flush down your toilet? Do we want to be flood irrigating dairy pasture to the extent we currently do? What else do we want to use that water for? So we still have a lot of water in Australia. We've just got to get a lot better at using it and getting that fundamental issue sorted out, that if you take too much water out of river systems, what you ultimately do is undermine the security of human beings' water supply.
Thank you. Paul Sinclair from the Australian Conservation Foundation. Our second Canadian guest is Dr. Gwyn Dyer, who's made a career writing about international affairs rather than environmental issues, but the two things come together in his new book called Climate Wars. And Gwyn Dyer, you see an intensifying conflict ahead over water, I think.
Well, I see people in the military and strategic community foreseeing those conflicts. I mean, it's quite interesting that in the Pentagon in particular, there is a view that climate change is the next meal ticket. You know, when the war on terror goes away, which it will, inshallah, there has to be something to take its place. We must justify our existence and our budgets to the people who pay the taxes. Here's the next meal ticket. And in terms of the impacts of climate change, both they and I think, I don't agree with them on the rest of it, but both they and I think that the early impacts will mostly be in the form of diminishing water supplies. It's not that there'll be less water available, less rain available in a warmer world. Obviously, the evaporation rates go up in a warmer world, but the rain falls in different places. And what the climate scientists are telling us is that the area, which, by the way, Australia lies in, which is on the border between the subtropics and the temperate zone, is the area which will see the greatest drop in rainfall. And so we are looking at serious shortfalls in food production, which is, of course, very closely related to rain. And that is where the security issues arise. I mean, people, as an anthropologist friend of mine once said, people always raid before they starve. If you are looking, let us say, at a world a degree and a half warmer than the present, or than 1990, which is the benchmark, you may find quite catastrophic falls in agricultural production in that belt, like, well, the Mediterranean zone, for example, is in it, the American South and Central America is in it, well, most of Australia is in it, Southern Africa is in it. These are the breadbaskets of the planet. I've had people sit across the table from me in Washington this year and perfectly seriously suggest that 2 degrees hotter means that there is no further agricultural production in the Central Valley of California, because what used to fall as snow in the wintertime on the high mountains and feed the rivers in the summer when it melted will fall as rain in the winter at 2 degrees hotter and run off right away, leaving nothing in those rivers in the summer. The high plains of the United States, same story. Severe fall in rain at the same time as they finally pump their aquifers dry. So even visions of a collapse in the global grain market. You can't buy your way out of this problem because there's no international grain for sale. We saw a precursor of this, a very minor one, that with the rice prices over the past year. India banned rice exports. Many Southeast Asian countries banned rice exports. We're going to feed our own people first. That's where the perception, and I think it's not inaccurate, of conflicts arising out of climate change, first generation, come from. It will be water, and water is food.
Gwyn Dyer, thank you. Our fourth guest is a proponent of the dismal science who's been worrying about water since the 1980s. Economist Professor John Quiggin is a Federation Fellow at the University of Queensland and the author of one of Australia's longest running and most prominent blogs. John Quiggin, we call economics a dismal science, but in fact, it often seems to be a misnomer. It often seems to me to be an incredibly optimistic science because there's no problem too great, no problem too difficult, too large, too complex that can't be solved with a liberal dose of the market.
Well, in fact, I regularly give a talk called Economics, the Hopeful Science. And so there is a degree of optimism and indeed over-optimism. I think if the market alone was going to solve our problems in Australia, they'd be fixed already because we've been pursuing a market route for the last 15 years, and obviously we haven't fixed all our problems so far. I think there's a couple of limits that people fail to observe in the first enthusiasm for the market. The first is water's heavy. You said that Australia is the world's driest continent, but my old colleague Bruce Davidson used to delight in making the point that Australia is the world's wettest continent in terms of the amount of water there is per person. But it's all in the wrong places. Water weighs a kilo a litre, a tonne a kilolitre. You expect to get that delivered to your house for $1. And there aren't very many things that you can have a tonne of turn up at your house reliably for $1. And so that's the first problem, that the idea of a national water market is really a nonsense because there are so many local things. Water is an intensely local commodity. And I think it's that pattern between surplus or abundance in some places and scarcity in others that makes the politics of water so fraught. The second thing is that the market simply, as it was created, didn't have any role for the environment. The environment wasn't bidding. It's only in the last few months that we've seen water actually bought on behalf of the environment, and most of that water is virtually in a different sense. It's water rights that don't exist because we haven't had the rain to make them happen. So I think those are the limitations of the market, but at the same time, I think we're not going to achieve a sustainable outcome without markets, without valuing water and without pricing it. We gave water away for nothing. We did that for 100 years in the interests of national development on the rather odd theory that since water was vital, we shouldn't impose any restrictions on its use, which does seem to me rather strange. So I think we're not going to succeed without prices, without markets, but naive faith in markets hasn't served us well.
Thanks, John Quiggin. And I want to take off from that point because there's a question here. I suppose there's two issues here. There's the value of water, how important it is, how crucial it is, and there's the price of water, the price we put on it. I think at the moment you can get 1,000 litres of Melbourne drinking water for about $1, as you said, John Quiggin. 1,000 litres of irrigation water for something like 13 cents, I think, Paul Sinclair. And that's in fact incredibly cheap. So there is an argument that we should be making water much more expensive if we want to use it more carefully. More, Bar?
Well, I think there's an enormous difference between pricing water if it's done by governments, and you're not pricing the actual water, you're charging people for the service for the water, and I absolutely agree we have to start doing that. I would argue that it needs to be done in block pricing, so that there's a very basic low level of charging for basic needs, so that no one is ever denied water because they can't afford it. And we believe very strongly in my world, in our movement, that water is a fundamental human right. And then as you use more and unnecessarily use more, you pay lots. But there's a big difference between that and commodification. I think we tend to get them confused. I think people who hear people like me saying we're against privatization and private ownership and private control of water are against pricing it, and that's not true. If you're pricing it, if you're a large corporation like Suez or Vivendi and you're operating as they are all through the global south and here in Australia and many places, you're going to have to work on a for-profit basis for your investors. And if you're charging money, which they do, very high tariffs, you are not going to provide water to people who cannot afford it. If government is charging a fair price and a block price for the service, then that money comes back for infrastructure, for source protection and so on. So I really think it's important that we not assume that those of us who are criticizing privatization say it's a free-for-all. Everybody can help themselves. One of the problems with water is that has not been managed. We have not seen it as something that's collectively ours, not only to use, to access as a commons, but that we need to have collective control over. But the notion that therefore, because we can price it, it's privatized and it's okay to let the market make decisions, I think is profoundly wrong. And the less water you have, and you don't have a lot of water in this country left, the more important it is to take public control, to say that water is a public trust, belongs to all Australians, belongs to future generations, belongs to the ecosystem, and anyone who accesses it must be paying for it only in a way that's done sustainably. Right now, there are privileges in this country to the mining industry, to certain parts of agriculture, to certain industries and so on, where governments look the other way, and ordinary people like the people fighting for their rights in the Moorabool River, for instance, who are here tonight, the wonderful people called People for a Living Moorabool, just get written off because everything's gone market, and water is now a private commodity. If you're big, if you can pay for it, you can access it. And I think it's at the heart of the question that we have to deal with.
But still, we've had state entities running our water businesses in Australia for a long period of time. They haven't necessarily done it very well because, for example, state governments have an interest in extracting, John Quiggin, the maximum value out of those water companies rather than necessarily investing in innovation or improving the delivery or the conservation of water.
That's part of the problem. I think the real difficulty has been the dominance of a developmentalist ethos for a very long period. I generally endorse what Maud said. I don't think we need a complicated tariff. I think a simple fixed allowance per person and then a price which reflects marginal cost would solve a lot of our problems.
Paul Sinclair?
Well, I think the thing to add, though, is that price of water needs to include not just recovering the cost for the concrete and that sort of infrastructure, but also it needs to generate an income to protect the natural infrastructure that ultimately sustains the water supply system. So in Melbourne, one of the good things the Victorian government has done is to put a 5% levy on the block tariff that is meant to be being reinvested back into protecting our catchments. Now, I think that 5% needs to be a lot higher. The other thing to note too is that block tariff has been introduced into Melbourne and there is an environmental sort of surcharge on that. And Melburnians haven't been screaming and wailing in the streets about the increased price they're paying for water generally, which I think is a positive sign.
Well, that's talking about urban water. What about rural water? As we've heard, 70% of water is going to agriculture. What about pricing? Surely we need to price the water that's being used for irrigation more appropriately.
Absolutely. The Israelis have had a block tariff structure for agricultural water, so the more you use, the more you pay, since the 1950s. I think we need to be looking at innovative ways of pricing irrigation water, which is the bulk of Australia's water use. And importantly, that price of water needs to pay for the maintenance of the natural assets, our river channels. At the moment, the delivery of irrigation water completely stuffs up most of our river systems, and yet who is it that ultimately pays to maintain those systems? Well, it's you and I and the general taxpayer.
Perhaps I'll jump in and be the economist on this. As far as irrigation water is concerned, I think trade between farmers has in fact helped us to survive the current drought. It has taken water out of industries like rice, which are very water intensive, flood irrigation. Rice growers have sold their water to horticultural producers who need to keep their crops alive. So without wanting to say that markets solve all the problems, I think we have got some substantial benefits from water markets within agriculture. The problem rather has been that when we created those markets, we gave away too many rights, more water than there was, and we didn't have any procedure or willingness to, or finance for, getting water back for the environment until the last few months.
Well, Bala, that's where the benefits of water trading come in. It means that water will be used for the more productive uses rather than more wasteful uses. Isn't that the idea?
Possibly. It could also be that those with money, some of the big agribusiness farms and companies can access that water, those water rights, because they have more money, and the smaller farmers get put out of business. I understand there have been, there's been a feeling that some of it's been successful here, but those kind of decisions don't necessarily have to be left up to the market. And if you leave it up to the market and you unbundle, that's the term here, is that you've unbundled the water from the land, you've let private brokers make money from potentially removing water from the land that is needed for sustaining a healthy hydrologic cycle. If we could see water as a public trust and a commons, such as the people of Vermont have just done, they just passed groundbreaking legislation which extended the public trust doctrine to their groundwater. Then they set up a permitting system. They said nobody owns that water. It belongs to all of us, and the only way you can access it is that you will, beyond a certain amount per day, you will have to have a permitting scheme, and it will have to be done on a sustainable basis. And furthermore, if there's a shortage, and there's a shortage here in Australia, there are priorities put on it. And they say very clearly in their legislation, water for living, water for local food production second, and commercial and export, water for export food a distant third. And I do think we're going to have to talk about this concept of virtual water and how much water is shipped out on a for-profit basis out of this country, which cannot afford it, on a daily basis.
Well, if I could jump in, I think it's very important that Australia is a food exporter. The world has to be fed, and we have to play our role in feeding it. And I think the notion that we should keep the food or the water for ourselves, I don't find that entirely convincing.
But doesn't the question, John, come back to the value of the food that we're producing, though?
Well, I think it does, but it's very difficult because water is such a complicated commodity. I think it's very difficult to try and assess that in some sort of ex post sense, to look at the product and see where the water is that produced it and where it came from and how much there is. Water is sometimes very abundant and cheap, and sometimes very scarce. That's the kind of thing that markets, in fact, do relatively well. And I think the problem with, say, the Murray-Darling is these systems flow for thousands of miles. There's no sense in which the people at the top of the system, who are the ones who got the water first, own it any more than, our problems have always been that the people at the top have taken it out and none flows to the bottom.
If it were properly managed by an authority that was a public authority, not on a for-profit basis, I think those decisions could be made in a more equitable way. I mean, everyone here at this table and every scientist in Australia is telling us that the Murray-Darling is so overextended that something dramatic has to be done. In the papers today, the acidic, the growth of the acid that's poisoning the system is continuing unabated. I mean, we could see the death of a living system here. So something fairly dramatic, it would seem to me, has to be done. And when I would think that when we're thinking around the world about the notion of unlimited growth, and people are questioning economic globalization and the notion of export competition in a world that's running out of resources, and we're all turning to more sustainable methods of food production, the notion of more sustainable local communities, this is one of the answers for Australia. And if I lived here, I would be really angry about the amount of water that was being shipped to permit other countries to not have to look at their water footprint. That the theory around virtual water out there for those who want to keep globalization going is, well, those countries that have lots of rain, what they call green water, the water that evaporates through the vegetation and so on, that they will grow, that's an advantage, and they'll grow food and they'll send it to countries that have to use their blue water, their rivers and their aquifers and so on. But that's not how it's operating. The two of the biggest virtual water exporters in the world are the United States and Australia, neither one of whom has that kind of water. And I've also visited many, many communities in Africa where the water is being decimated by this notion of virtual water. All the roses in Europe are growing around the lake where Out of Africa was filmed. It's called Lake Naivasha, and the lake will be dead in 10 years. We're not thinking about the long-term sustainability when we think about when we buy into the notion that we can continue to grow in an unlimited way and never have to face the consequences.
This is the National Interest on ABC Radio National with a forum on water recorded at the 2008 Melbourne Writers' Festival. My guests are Canadian environmentalist and writer Maud Barlow, Dr. Paul Sinclair from the Australian Conservation Foundation, that blogging economist, Professor John Quiggin, and Gwyn Dyer, also from Canada, who's the author of Climate Wars. And Gwyn Dyer, I want to come to you on this point. Maud Barlow's been arguing really almost for an autarkic type of situation where countries retain their water and grow food only for themselves. Is that what you would see as a way to go forward?
It's not what I would choose, but I think it's what we're going to get. In the sense that on the assumption, which I cannot guarantee to be true, but seems very likely, that we are going to see severe falls in agricultural production in a climate change regime. I mean, I was in New Delhi, for example, about 2 years ago, and I spoke to someone, head of a think tank there, who had just done a contract for the World Bank, who'd come to her and asked if she could figure out what 2 degrees hotter would do to Indian food production. And she'd done all the due diligence and divided the country into 186 grid squares, and came back with the aggregate number of a 25% fall in Indian food production at 2 degrees hotter. Well, India just about feeds itself now. I mean, you could say it is autarkic. Very inefficient agriculture, but at least it does actually feed itself. The population will continue to go up, and it will be able to feed 3/4 of the present population at 2 degrees hotter. That's not autarky, that's below autarky, that's below self-sufficiency, but if a large number of countries end up below self-sufficiency and the global grain market collapses because nobody's exporting, I think you have a rather unpleasant world.
Peter, sorry, because I think there is, like the global food issue is a interconnected issue. So we can't think about global food production and the limitations on developing countries to produce food without looking at, as Oxfam International have pointed out, the dramatic cuts in developing countries' R&D in agriculture, and the sort of aid that is provided by first world countries to developing countries has been cut dramatically at the same time as R&D in their own countries has gone up. So there's an interconnection between the challenge isn't just, goodness me, how can we continue to suck 80% out of the Murray to feed the starving people of the world? It's a broader question about the equity of development that's going on here. And I do have a question I need to get out before I forget it, is surely water can also be a source of cooperation as well as conflict, and I'd be interested in any examples.
Well, of course it can. And, one needn't actually worry about the sources of cooperation. I worry about the sources of conflict. Obviously almost all large agricultural systems, particularly those involving irrigation, involve huge amounts of cooperation. People are cooperative. But in the end, if there's not enough, for example, if there is not enough water in the Indus River system to keep Pakistan going, and Pakistan is a country which is essentially a desert with a river running through it. The glaciers that feed those rivers are melting. The Chinese Academy of Sciences say they're melting at 7% a year. They're losing that much mass. They're half gone in 10 years. Once they're gone, it's the same story as the Sierra Nevada and the Central Valley in America. There's no river, or there's no water in those rivers, or very little water in those rivers in the summertime. And what does Pakistan do then? And I'd love to see it cooperate with India, but do you really think that's going to be the chosen solution?